In 2018, Sondos Alcatan, a Kuwaiti social media influencer, confidently posted something on Instagram where she condemned new legislation that allows Filipino workers in Kuwait to have a day off per week and grants them the right to keep their passports. Her words were, quote, "How can you have a servant at home who keeps their own passport with them? And what's worse is that they have one day off every week. I don't want a Filipina maid anymore." End of quote. Now, I may have mentioned this story once or twice before in another episode or on social media. Now, Alcatan's post resulted in an immediate backlash against the influencer, but she found the reaction to her post rather unjustified and chose to double down. She did eventually delete her video, but her remarks and the remarks of followers and non-followers who shared the same sentiment and made such shared sentiment known in her comment section made things clear for a lot of Filipinos. Some migrant workers are not seen as deserving of the same rights as the people they work for. I would go as far as saying, and this is not controversial at all, by the way, that in some countries, migrant workers are seen as less than human, therefore not even deserving of basic respect. Alcatan's words and thinking are not harmless, though. If you think that this kind of thinking will just remain as some poorly thought out Instagram post, think twice. Many share the sentiment and some do not do anything about it, but it is those who think this way and act upon or according to such a thinking who make living as an OFW abroad dangerous, if not downright fatal. And I know that we, especially those who have grown up in the Philippines, have become so desensitized over the years and decades whenever we see wooden caskets being shown on the news. But truly, we need to come out of this desensitized state. We need the outrage. We need the concern. We need the hope that one day our children will not be confronted by TV images of caskets containing fellow Filipinos whose humanity has been denied and brutally trampled on. This is the case of Jullebee Cabilis Ranara. Mabuhay, Lagim fam. Welcome to another episode of Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. You are currently listening to episode 17 of season 4. If you're new here, welcome to the Lagim fam. And if you've been here since day one, welcome back and thank you for stopping by again. If you want to know how to support me or follow me on social media, make sure to stay until the very end of this episode and also to check out my show notes. As always, details in this case might be triggering for some people, so please take care of yourself whilst listening. The first thing you notice about Jullebee from the many photos online is this gentle kindness in her eyes. There is a softness in the way she looks at the camera and flashes a slight smile. The 34-year-old always wanted to help her family. She was the mother of 4 children, and she was worried not only about them, but also about her aging parents. So in order to help her family, she decided to do what a lot of Filipinos have done in the past and are still doing today: work abroad as an overseas Filipino worker, or OFW. Some articles about Jullebee have mentioned that she first tried her luck in Bahrain, but I could not find when exactly she went there. All I have found was that after her stint in Bahrain, she then decided to find work in Kuwait in July 2022. Now, Kuwait is an OFW destination that is preferred by many Filipinos since it is easier to get in and find work, but most of all, the placement fee is lower than that of other countries. It is, after all, a rich Gulf country that prides itself in being a cultural center in the Middle East. The weather is arid and it considers its citizens to be hospitable and welcoming. But since 2018, OFWs had become hesitant to go due to high-profile abuse and murder cases involving Filipino domestic workers. Kuwait had had to suddenly invest lots of time in maintaining their diplomatic relationship with the Philippines, who back in 2018 was under the Duterte administration. So what happened in 2018? Well, the story actually starts in January 2013 when a 26-year-old Filipina by the name of Joanna de Mafilis worked as a housekeeper in Parañaque. She was content and made enough money for herself and her family back in Iloilo. But then, Typhoon Yolanda, also known as Typhoon Haiyan, hit eastern Visayas in late 2013, and life suddenly turned upside down for the young woman and her family in Sara, Iloilo. Her family had become homeless and incomeless from one second to the next. The rice and sugarcane fields that her parents had worked on before were now filled with debris, and the infrastructure in the area was so severely damaged that each day came with one hardship worse than the last. Suddenly, Joanna's salary was not enough anymore to sustain herself and her family back in Iloilo. So whilst still working in Parañaque, she decided to make plans to leave the country. Joanna reached out to a distant aunt who was then able to help her to go to Kuwait by May 2015. So let's briefly talk about Kuwait. Kuwait has always been rich. It is a very small country, but it also has enough oil reserves to propel them to number 4 on the list of the richest countries per capita in the world. With such wealth and a growing middle class, demands for domestic workers kept and keeps on growing by the day. There's just one problem. Domestic foreign workers in countries like Kuwait are subject to the so-called kafala system. The kafala system, according to the Council of Foreign Relations, is a sponsorship system that defines the relationship between foreign workers and their local sponsor, or kafil, which is usually their employer. Under this system, the state gives local individuals or companies sponsorship permits to employ foreign laborers, except in Bahrain apparently, where workers are sponsored by a government agency rather than individual employers. The sponsor covers travel expenses and provides housing, often in dorm-like accommodations, or in the case of domestic workers, the sponsor's home. Rather than hiring an individual directly, sponsors sometimes use private recruitment agencies in the countries of origin to find workers and facilitate their entry into the host country. This system is usually overseen by interior ministries and not labor ministries, which is problematic as this means that every worker under the kafala system cannot be protected under a country's labor laws. This makes them vulnerable to exploitation. So what does this look like on the ground? Well, they are denied the right to enter a labor dispute process or even join a union. Since a worker's visa and employment are linked and a worker's sponsor is the only one who can renew or end them, the worker is wholly at the mercy of said sponsors or employers. The employers have control over the worker's legal status, which ultimately creates a huge and rather daunting power imbalance that can be and has been exploited over and over again. There is little recourse when workers face exploitation, and if they try to flee because of it and other reasons like abuse, then they could be thrown in prison or deported. Critics of the system have called it a system of modern slavery, since with the mentioned power imbalance also comes impunity when the sponsors commit horrific acts that make the lives of the workers miserable. We have heard cases of workers' restricted movements and communications, confiscation of passports and phones, debt bondage, forced labor, unpaid wages, deprivation of liberty, racism, misogyny, sexism, verbal, physical, and sexual abuse, just to name a few. Joanna was aware of the general gist of what it means to work in Kuwait that has the kafala system, and before Typhoon Yolanda, she probably would never have decided to leave, let alone leave for Kuwait, but times were hard, and so with her parents' blessing, she left. In Joanna's case specifically, it is not clear when the problems started, but I dare to guess probably right away, since it became clear early on that Joanna's communication freedom was severely restricted. Her employers confiscated her cell phone and she was only allowed to use it once every 3 months. I'm not sure what else was taken from her and the specific things that happened during her 2-year employment within the household of Lebanese national Nader Issam Asaf and his Syrian wife Mona Hassoun. But what we do know was that by September 2016, all communications from Joanna suddenly stopped. The first few hours or days after not hearing from a friend or family member who normally communicates frequently and or regularly are moments filled with doubt and uncertainty. Are we overreacting? Should we do something big and drastic? Do we call the police? Do we call a lawyer? Can anyone remember whether the missing person said something about being off the grid, hence the silence? These are just a few of the many questions that could percolate in a loved one's mind when they feel like something is off. Despite instinct telling us that something is potentially very wrong, we can be held back by past experiences with the police or other authorities, and by maybe having made a mistake in the past as well. So we wait and sit and wait some more until we arrive at a point where we know for sure that something is indeed wrong. I'm not sure if Joanna's family went through these motions, but we know that they had alerted government officials about Joanna. They specifically approached the OWA, or the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration, and the POEA, or the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration. These two state agencies failed to find Joanna because her recruitment agency had already stopped operating and closed up shop. After this point, it would seem that nothing much happened in this case until the Kuwaiti authorities received a call from Joanna's employers who told them that she went missing. This call was made in November 2016, almost 2 months after Joanna stopped communicating with her family. Now, this next part is something that was difficult to confirm in my research. After the call in November 2016, it would seem that nothing much happened in the case again for over a year. I do not know how the Kuwaiti authorities worked this case in 2016 that then made them conduct a manhunt in 2018, but they did initiate this and looked for Joanna. The manhunt only stopped when Joanna's body was found in a freezer at her employer's abandoned apartment. This was in February 2018. Over a year after the young Filipina was reported missing. When the question came up as to where Joanna's employers were, authorities in Kuwait learned that the Lebanese and Syrian couple who hired her fled to Kuwait with their 2 children in November 2016, making a stop in Lebanon before proceeding to war-torn Syria, where both were apprehended by local authorities with the help of Interpol in 2018 as well. Now, when Joanna's body was examined afterwards, it spoke of a horrible story full of pain, struggle, and torture. Medical examiners estimated that she must have died over a year before she was found. Joanna's ribs were shattered and she showed signs of internal hemorrhaging and of being strangled. Her body was subsequently flown back to the Philippines in a wooden box that her heartbroken family met with tears and pleas for justice.
Joanna Demafelis went to Kuwait 4 years ago to work as a maid. She returned home in a coffin, her distraught sister in tears as the wooden casket was carried off a plane.
This is a very big loss to us. She used to tell our mother her dreams. She was working abroad to be able to help our parents and our youngest sibling.
The family says Joanna's employer was strict and only allowed her to call home 3 times a year. But in 2016, the call stopped. They had no idea why until last week when a body was found in a freezer in an abandoned apartment in Kuwait City. It was Joanna's. Investigators say her body showed signs of strangulation and may have been in the freezer for more than a year.
We will probably never learn what kind of hell Joanna went through at the hands of her employers, but we have some snippets here and there from some reports that mentioned how her female employers seemed addicted to treating Joanna badly and hurting her. I'm sorry, but I cannot even imagine what this means. It shows such little regard for Joanna's dignity and humanity. It shows such a level of evil, the kind that you would not want to wish upon your worst enemy. Nader Issam Asaf, after being arrested in Syria, was transported back to Beirut, Lebanon, where he ended up confessing to murdering Joanna whilst his wife, Mona, remained in custody in her native Syria. She would face justice there when she was found guilty of murdering Joanna. Asaf would also be found guilty. Both were also tried and found guilty in absentia in Kuwait in April 2018, and then were sentenced to death by hanging. The fallout of this case was swift and heavy. Former President Duterte went on a tirade, offending Kuwaiti sensitivities and adding to already tense diplomatic relations by ordering a ban on further OFW deployment to Kuwait. This was swiftly criticized by Kuwaiti officials, but the former president could not be stopped. Just note that this ban was eventually lifted following the conviction of Joanna's employers in Kuwait. Anyway, Duterte then dispatched commercial airplanes to Kuwait to transport back to the Philippines all OFWs who wanted to return as a result of Joanna's case. 116 OFWs took the former president up on his offer. When they arrived, they each received grocery bags and cash assistance totaling 15,000 pesos. Then presidential spokesperson Harry Roque earlier said that OWA will also give 20,000 pesos livelihood aid to the repatriated workers. Whilst this all sounded nice, we all know that this was a band-aid solution, as these gifts were no long-term solutions to the problems that brought the OFWs to another place in the first place. Following this mini exodus of some OFWs from Kuwait, we would also learn from the Philippine government that there were around 6,000 complaints of abuse from OFWs that were received by the Philippine ambassador to Kuwait. According to Rappler, quote, following Joanna's death, the Department of Labor and Employment, or DOLE, set up a command center for OFW abuse cases and sent a rapid response team to monitor abuse cases in Gulf countries. Joanna's death prompted the governments of the Philippines and Kuwait to agree to fast-track a bilateral agreement that promises more protection for tens of thousands of OFWs in Kuwait. End of quote. In all this melee, people may have forgotten who was at the center of this issue: Joanna. Joanna, who arrived in Kuwait as a healthy 26-year-old in 2014, now had to be buried by her family. She was laid to rest in Sara, Iloilo on March 3, 2018, and there was perhaps hope that Joanna's untimely death would become a lesson learned, that her death was not to be in vain, that OFWs in abusive households and who have complained will not have to end up the same way she did, that protection would be strengthened, but that hope was abruptly dashed when 14 months after Joanna was laid to rest, another OFW was discovered dead in Kuwait. Joanna's story, sadly, is not unique. Stories of maltreatment and abuse are probably way too common amongst OFWs, and our government knows this. Not all of the reports about them make it to the authorities, and even fewer catch the media's attention. And I am certain that with Joanna's story blowing up like it did, Jullebee Ranara in 2022 may also have had some apprehension about going into Kuwait. But if she had them, she seemed to have ignored them because, like I mentioned, she made her way to Kuwait in July of 2022. She was recruited through a Filipino agency named Catalyst International Manpower Services Company and its Kuwaiti counterpart, Platinum International Office for Recruitment of Domestic Manpower. She was placed with a Kuwaiti family, which included a 17-year-old young man. This is important. In conversations with her family during her first few months with the Kuwaiti family, Jullebee could not help but reveal that she was not feeling safe. Some stories she told her mom and family included incidents when the 17-year-old young man would threaten her with a knife, and how when he was in a bad mood, he would take off his school uniform and throw it in her face, not showing her any amount of respect at all. Jullebee probably had more stories to tell, but she also likely did not want to worry her family. But they did worry and asked her to come home, to which Jullebee said, "It is fine, I can still take it. Kaya ko pa naman." For reasons that will become clear later, we do not know if Jullebee in those early days was physically abused or not. I say this because in another case, we did learn that physical abuse was very much a possible reality for another OFW named Constancia Lago Dayag, who arrived in Kuwait in 2016. I say possible reality because this case is officially still ongoing and we still have so many unanswered questions. Now, with Constancia, she completed her first 2-year contract within her first household before going back to the Philippines. She then decided to come back and work for the same family again. This brings us to 2019, the year after the Kuwait ban was lifted following Joanna Di Mafeli's murder. Please note that the ban was lifted after the Philippines and Kuwait signed an agreement to regulate the employment of OFWs in Kuwait. More details to that later. As a side note as well, reports show that between Joanna's body being discovered and before the ban was lifted, around 5,000 maltreated Filipino workers were repatriated. Now back to Constancia. In May 2019, the 47-year-old was taken to a hospital in Kuwait, but to the shock of the hospital staff, she was already lifeless. Not long after, allegations of physical and sexual abuse surfaced, and they were directed at her employers. Following this, Constancia's 60-year-old employer was arrested for questioning, but he was not named as a primary suspect outright, and I assume he was not charged for anything in those early days either. The initial reporting on this case was a bit insidious. Somehow her death, according to unidentified sources, was said to have been of natural causes, and one might think that this was perhaps a way to minimize what had really happened to her or to cast doubt on the ongoing Kuwaiti investigation. But then again, there were also reports about how Constancia's body bore various contusions, hematoma, and signs of sexual assault. Now, these reports were also criticized, but rang more true to the people who were following the case. The Kuwaiti authorities were not publicly sharing what they found out, or at least I could not find any English language news source that contained any reference to any details of their investigation, especially about Constancia's autopsy results. At this point, Filipino authorities were demanding for the Kuwaiti authorities to hand over their findings. It is unclear whether this ever took place or not. What we do know is that Filipino authorities also wanted to conduct their own autopsy, so efforts were made to repatriate Constancia's body as soon as possible. This way, she could also be reunited with her family. When Constancia's body was finally brought back from Kuwait, the authorities got to work on the autopsy. Sadly, we are still waiting for those results, and we still cannot get any clarity as to what had happened to Constancia.
Nasuhan na ng Department of Foreign Affairs ang nasa likod di mano ng pagpatay kay Constancia Dayag, ang OFW na pinatay at pinaniniwalaan ding ni-rape sa Kuwait. Ngayong linggo ay naasahang maiuuwi na ang kanyang labi. May report si JP Soriano.
Nagsampa na ng kasong kriminal ang ating Department of Foreign Affairs laban sa may kagagawa ng pagkamatay ng OFW sa Kuwait na si Constancia Lago Dayag. pero hindi binanggit ng DFA kung sino ang sinampahan nila ng kaso. Si Constancia ang 47 taong gulang na domestic worker sa Kuwait na sinaktan at pinatay at pinagsamantalahan pa raw. Ang isa sa 3 anak ni Constancia na si Lovely, said na raw ang luha sa pagdadalamhati. Birthday pa naman ang kanyang ina bukas at dapat isang kaunting salo-salo ang kanilang pinaplano sa kanyang nakatakda sanang pagbabalik bayan bago siya pinaslang. Ayon kay Lovely, naalala niya ang huling na ikwento ng ina sa kanya bago pumanaw.
Na pinagseselosan po siya ng kanyang among babae. Meron po yung time na nag-away po sila ni Madam Kanema na regarding nga po sa mga ganyan. Pinapauwi ko na po siya.
With speculations swirling around about the specifics of Constancia's death, the DFA, or the Department of Foreign Affairs, had apparently decided to file a complaint against whoever they had deemed responsible for Constancia's death at that time. The Department of Foreign Affairs never revealed who they filed the complaint against. Having said all that, though, Constancia's family and the public still wanted to know more about the circumstances surrounding Constancia's death in order to fully put an end to all sorts of speculations. However, until the National Bureau of Investigation, or NBI, finalizes their report, we will never know what truly happened to Constancia. I am deeply disappointed that this is taking such a long time. As for Constancia's family, they needed to move forward after Constancia was repatriated and after the autopsy. So, Constancia was laid to rest in June 2019 in Angadanan, Isabela, and her family are still waiting for definitive answers. In the meantime, the Kuwaiti authorities finally charged Constancia's employer, named Badr Ibrahim Muhammad Hussein, with felony murder. Could this be taken as a sign that the Kuwaiti authorities have strong evidence that this person murdered Constancia, that they are perhaps confident that their case is strong? It would feel so, and that is as far as we can speculate. My ultimate wish for the Dayag family is for them to get solid answers from the autopsies that were performed by either the Kuwaitis or the NBI. We are in 2023 already, and they have been waiting for 4 years for some clarity and closure, something that they badly need and deserve in order to move on from this tragic moment in their lives. Six months after Constancia Lago Dayag was laid to rest, and 4 years before we would be introduced to Jullebee Ranara in the most awful of circumstances, we would first hear of Ginelyn Padernal Villavende. Ginelyn was from Norala, South Cotabato, and in October 2019, she was 26 years old. October 2019 is a significant point in telling Ginelyn's case because it was in this month that her family back in Cotabato would start to only sporadically hear from her. The infrequency of calls bothered and worried them. Ginelyn was very new to Kuwait, having arrived only in July 2019. Her first week, according to her, went smoothly and without a hitch. But this honeymoon phase did not last long. By October, as I mentioned, things started to change. Her family would later state that on the rare occasion that they got to speak to Ginelyn, she would always be in a hurry because her female employer would constantly interrupt and demand that Ginelyn translated her private conversations into English so that the employer would understand. Ginelyn's family worried that perhaps she was being abused already, and the phone interruptions were just a minor part of said abuse. As the weeks after October progressed, all communications from Ginelyn eventually stopped, prompting her family to ask for help from the agency that made it possible for Ginelyn to go to Kuwait. But they were not much of a help. Attempts would be made to call Ginelyn after that, and by the 11th of December 2019, someone finally answered her phone. To her family's surprise, though, it was her female employer who picked up the phone to tell them that Ginelyn was not able to come to the phone as she was very busy. 2 days later, Ginelyn's family called again, but this time her employers were saying something totally different. The family was told that Gina Lynn was on her way back to the Philippines. When the family asked the female employer why, they were given a rather bizarre answer. Apparently, Gina Lynn refused to cook at 10 a.m. one day and the employer was angered by this. I took this as her saying that she fired Gina Lynn. After that odd conversation with the female employer, they would not hear anything from anyone again until the 28th of December, when an official from the Department of Foreign Affairs informed them that sadly, their lovely Gina Lynn was killed. At that point, it was unclear when Gina Lynn exactly died, and further details about how she died were also unknown. Later, her family would learn that Gina Lynn was rushed to a hospital by her male employer on the 28th of December, but hospital staff realized pretty quickly that Gina Lynn was already dead. Sounds familiar? Her body was described as being covered in bruises, black and blue. An autopsy was later conducted and it was concluded that Gina Lynn died of, quote, acute failure of heart and respiration as a result of shock and multiple injuries in the vascular nervous system, end of quote, which is a fancy way of saying that she was beaten up so badly that her heart and breathing stopped due to shock. What was even more heartbreaking in Gina Lynn's case was that she was also repeatedly raped. Furthermore, there was evidence of older bruises and wounds, which signaled to the medical examiners in the Philippines that she was beaten up repeatedly way before the day she died. The Kuwaiti autopsy reports did not include any mention of past sexual and physical abuse, which angered some members of Congress. Now, I may have gotten ahead of myself there a little bit, mentioning to you the results of the NBI autopsy already. So let me backtrack for the sake of our timeline. After the autopsy in Kuwait, Gina Lynn's body was flown home on January 8th, 2020. And at this point, her employers had long been detained and eventually charged. Both would be tried under Sharia law in Kuwait. It was around this time as well that the NBI conducted their own autopsy. Naturally, a lot of Filipinos were angered by yet another brutal death of an OFW so soon after the ban was lifted following Joanna's death, so soon after Constancia's death, and so soon after both the Philippines and Kuwait signed an agreement in May of 2018 that was useless, obviously, in protecting both Constancia and Gina Lynn. What hurts even more was that, according to some reports, Gina Lynn was killed because her female employer was jealous of her. This left me speechless. Now here's another kicker that might just infuriate you even more. Gina Lynn made her agency aware of the maltreatment she was experiencing as early as September 2019, a mere 2 months or so after she arrived in Kuwait and less than 2 months before she died. Her complaint was never addressed. Tragic does not even begin to cut it. As for the government, the usual scenario unfolded in the early days after Gina Lynn was murdered. The Kuwaiti ambassador to the Philippines was summoned and told about the Filipinos' outrage over the lack of protection of domestic workers in Kuwait. There are over 250,000 OFWs in the small Gulf state, and it would seem that the high-profile cases of abuse and murder of OFWs coming out of Kuwait show that they are not protected as per the agreement between the two countries. The Foreign Affairs Department demanded a swift prosecution of the alleged murderers, Gina Lynn's employers. It warned recruiters who didn't do their due diligence and duty of care towards the OFWs they recruited. There was another threat to ban Pinoys from going to Kuwait for work, and the diplomatic ties between the two countries were threatened yet again. Now, this ban would never happen, however, because I think the Filipino authorities were satisfied with what came next by December 2020. On the 30th of December 2020, a Kuwaiti court found Gina Lynn's female employer guilty of assaulting and locking Gina Lynn in a room, whilst her husband was also found guilty of a lesser crime of covering up the crime and not reporting it to the authorities. The female employer was then sentenced to death, whilst her husband was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. Now, I only know very little about Sharia law, so I'm not clear as to why these were the charges brought against the couple and why murder as a charge and offense was not even mentioned. But the verdict and sentence were welcomed by Gina Lynn's family and the Philippine government. It is, I think, for this reason that there was no deployment ban from our government. I view this as a mistake, though. One successful prosecution in connection to one OFW is good on a micro level, but that does not change anything for the remaining OFWs, some of whom were and are still in danger. On the one hand, I would say, what good would a ban do if there's no stronger bilateral agreement between our countries? On the other hand, I can see how losing Kuwait as an economic partner in this particular regard could cause less opportunities for our fellow Pinoys abroad. On top of all that, what use is such an agreement with another country if laws and policies at home do not do enough to protect prospective OFWs right from the beginning? And if you want to really take it all the way back, why not fix the whole system so we do not have to send fellow Filipinos abroad in the first place? But of course, I digress. Now you're probably wondering, I was supposed to talk about Jullebee, but I had to tell you about Joanna, Constancia, and Gina Lynn first, before continuing with Jullebee's stories, because in my very own and personal opinion, our government had 3 opportunities to make it so much better for our kababayans abroad who came after Gina Lynn. Sure, they might not be able to address the systemic problems in our own country right away in order to create more jobs back home instead of having to send Pinoys abroad, because all administrations since Marcos Sr. had really not gotten it right anyway. But if we have these agreements with all these other countries already, why not demand better conditions, protection, and better, quicker avenues to address complaints from OFWs, right? It seems so simple, but I'm not naive. It never really is simple. I'm aware that agreements between countries in such matters will always reflect each country's competing interests. Strategic negotiations will be involved, compromises are inevitable, and in the end, you have a hybrid of each other's interests, where one party may get more than the other. Now, if you could indulge me one more time, here is a quick look into the Memorandum of Agreement signed by our country and Kuwait in May 2018 after Joanna was murdered. Its full name is the Agreement on the Employment of Domestic Workers. In it, passports and other travel documents are not allowed to be taken from our OFWs. They have the right to keep them plus their mobile phones and actually use them. OFWs are entitled to be provided housing, food, clothing, and health insurance by their sponsors, aka their employers. OFWs are entitled to at least 1 day off a week. Not enough in my opinion. They must never be transferred from one employer to another without the approval of the POEA. Lastly, any contract renewals need to be approved again by the POEA first and can never be automatically renewed again. It was after the signing of this agreement on May 11th, 2018, that influencers like Sondos Al-Katan, who I mentioned in my intro, and other Kuwaiti or Kuwaiti residents mouthed off their disapproval of what they viewed as concessions their government ended up making. By May 16th, the deployment ban was partially, so not fully lifted, and by May 22nd, former President Duterte stated that the relationship between our countries were quote-unquote okay. After Constancia and Gina Lynn, some Filipinos realized that the agreement did not really do much in terms of protecting the OFWs after all. I also feel like the government added insult to injury because in the year when we were waiting for justice to be served for Constancia and Gina Lynn in 2020, the government decided to fully lift the deployment ban that was imposed after Joanna's murder. Nothing else was done to perhaps strengthen the agreement that Kuwait and the Philippines signed back in 2018. No drastic action was taken at all. But then, Jullebee happened. In the lead up to the 21st of January 2023, friends of Jullebee started worrying about her radio silence. This was not normal of her. Jullebee's family also started to worry. They still spoke to her before January 21st, but then communication stopped. Eventually, one friend wrote on Facebook the following plea. Please note that the English translation was directly lifted from a Rappler article.
Baka po may mga friend dito si Jullebee Ranara sa Kuwait na nakakita sa kanya. Please lang po, PM naman po dyan. Mahigit na pong 24 oras na wala kaming balita sa kanya. In case any friend of Jullebee has seen her, please send me a message as we haven't heard from her for more than 24 hours already.
Alas, on the 21st of January, Kuwaiti authorities found Jullebee's charred remains abandoned in a desert on the Al Salmi Highway, a long stretch of a highway that leads directly from Kuwait City to Kuwait's border with Saudi Arabia. Less than 24 hours after Jullebee's remains were found, Kuwaiti news outlets had already started reporting about the gruesome discovery in the desert, upsetting many OFWs not only in Kuwait, but all around the world. Another 24 hours later, and the Kuwaiti police announced that they had arrested someone they were considering their main suspect. At the same time, the autopsy on Jullebee's body was started, and before the end of that day, we would learn some truly horrific things about what Jullebee had gone through. Jullebee's body was swabbed for any DNA trace evidence and then examined for a cause and manner of death. These were probably hard to determine since she was burned before being buried in the desert, but the Kuwaiti authorities would nevertheless later explain that Jullebee suffered from a head trauma that was so severe and brutal that her skull was crushed. What made this already horrific situation even more upsetting was that Jullebee, as it turned out, was at least 4 months pregnant. This meant that the father of the child could not have been her husband back home, as she had been gone from the Philippines for 6 months already at that time. Jullebee's murder obviously renewed tensions between Kuwait and the Philippines. Kuwait's ambassador to the Philippines, Musaid Salih Al-Twaik, expressed his condolences and assured our government that Jullebee's tragic passing was an isolated case. Except it is not, and we know that already. With the new president at the helm of the country, both this ambassador and the Filipinos were waiting for the new administration's next move. There was talk of a ban again, but this was not confirmed in the early days following Jullebee's murder. Instead, the Department of Migrant Workers, or DMW, proceeded to issue a preventive suspension against the recruitment agency that sent Jullebee to Kuwait. This meant that this agency was prevented from deploying any more new OFWs to the small Gulf state. A case was eventually filed as well against Catalyst International and its Kuwaiti counterpart, Platinum International. Now you might ask, what case are they actually filing against this agency entity? The case would be best described as a negligence case. Here's why. Agencies like Catalyst and Platinum have to comply with a mandatory monitoring requirement to ensure the well-being of our OFWs. Not only do they need to make sure you arrive safely abroad, but they also need to regularly monitor you in the form of visits and/or calls. In Jullebee's case, I've already mentioned that she had been complaining about her employer's son a few times in conversations with her family. Had there been regular monitoring in her case, this problem could have very likely been witnessed, addressed, and actioned. Alas, that was not the case, and we find ourselves learning about the awful things Julie had to endure instead. Following this set of actions, the Philippine government ultimately suspended the accreditation of all foreign recruitment agencies in Kuwait, essentially blacklisting them. One could argue that this was just a few steps short of a full deployment ban. But instead of a full ban later on, the government would impose a deferral on deployment of any newly hired OFWs bound for Kuwait. This was not received well by the Kuwaiti government, and so it decided to then suspend all entry and work visas for Filipinos later on. Things were rocky between the two countries, to say the least. Meanwhile, in Jullebee's case, you may have guessed it already, but the primary suspect who was arrested by the Kuwaiti police earlier was Jullebee's employer's 17-year-old son. From the Kuwaiti investigations, we would learn that Jullebee was not only severely beaten up and burnt, but also raped. It was then thought that the 17-year-old employer's son was the person who had raped Jullebee more than once, which later led to her pregnancy. The young man later confessed to all this to the police. Meanwhile, the Philippine authorities were eager to also conduct their own autopsy, and so efforts to repatriate Jullebee were initiated. By the 27th of January, Jullebee's body was flown back to Manila, where the NBI along with her family were waiting. Her body was then taken in for an autopsy. The results of the NBI's autopsy were consistent with the autopsy results of the Kuwaiti authorities, and so the next step would be to release her body back to her family so they could finally start their grieving process by burying their daughter, wife, and mother. Jullebee Ranara Cabilis was laid to rest at the Golden Haven Memorial Park in Las Piñas on the 5th of February 2023. She leaves behind 4 children, a husband, grieving parents, and a shocked country. In the wake of Jullebee's brutal murder, over 100 Filipinos left Kuwait for fear of their safety at the beginning of February 2023. At the time of their departure, over 268,000 Filipinos were still working in Kuwait, and of those, over 400 OFWs had sought shelter in an emergency center run by the Philippine government. That is 400 too many. Back home, Jullebee's family was still waiting for justice to be served whilst battling horrible accusations of having accepted blood money. These accusations were vehemently denied by the Ranaras. They admitted that a relative of Jullebee's employer had reached out to offer blood money, but before I even proceed any further, I think we need a brief explainer about what blood money is. An explainer is what I was missing from all the articles that I've read so far, and that is never helpful when you're trying to objectively understand and write about a different legal system. So again, please indulge me briefly in this tangent. Blood money in the Western world's understanding pertains to a bribe-like compensation paid to the family of someone who has been murdered. The payment is sometimes made to perhaps silence the family. In any case, the family profits from such awful tragedy, right? Now, blood money, as generally understood in the West and the former colonies, is a private arrangement. This is important to understand for later on. Blood money is a little bit differently understood in countries that follow Sharia law, Kuwait being one of them. Now, please remember that I only know the very basic, as I had to understand this concept pretty quickly so I can explain it to you for this episode. Blood money, or diya in the Arabic language, is seen as a form of monetary remedy in the Islamic legal tradition. Here is a quote from an academic paper published in the International Journal of Social Sciences and Humanities. Quote, "Originally, Sharia rules provided that in case where the physical injury was not severe, for example, only resulting in scars, a remedy called arsh was employed that generally did not exceed 1,000 dinar. in cases involving more extensive bodily harm, reparation would be decided by a judge known for having just and expert opinions. End of quote. Applying this to Kuwaiti law, we need to start with the premise that murder in the country's legal system is punishable by the so-called qisas. Roughly translated, this means an eye for an eye, or what is better known as retributive justice. A lot of times, this comes in the form of the death penalty. However, qisas can be removed as a punishment if the relatives of the murder victim choose to waive their right to see qisas implemented as a sentence and choose to receive diya or blood money instead. So going back to Jullebee's case, her family admitted that there was an offer, as the then suspect's relatives were already anticipating perhaps that their 17-year-old relative would soon be sentenced to death. The Ranaras said that they refused any offer of blood money. The Kuwaiti ambassador to the Philippines neither confirmed nor denied the veracity of this claim by Jullebee's family, so all we have is the claim of the Ranaras. I am sort of inclined to believe them because when someone knows that the death penalty could likely be the sentence in a case and blood money could potentially get that off the table, wouldn't you try it too? With the Ranaras refusing the blood money, everyone expected that if convicted, the 17-year-old young man who confessed to brutally beating, raping, and burning Jullebee could soon face state-sanctioned death. But we were all mistaken.
Kuwaiti court has convicted the killer of overseas Filipino worker Jullebee Ranara. The Foreign Affairs Department says a 15-year murder sentence was given to Turki Ayed Al-Azmi, the 17-year-old son of Ranara's employer. He was also slapped with a 1-year prison term for driving without a license. The DFA notes lesser penalties handed to Azmi due to him being a minor. The Philippine government meanwhile hails the Kuwaiti court's speedy resolution in attaining justice for Ranara.
By mid-September, 17-year-old Turki Ayed Al-Azmi was sentenced to 15 years in prison for murdering Jullebee Ranara and an additional 1 year in prison for driving without license. The Department of Foreign Affairs Undersecretary Eduardo de Vega, probably expecting some backlash from the Filipinos because of this sentence, explained that the decision to be lenient was due to Al-Azmi's young age and because he was a minor at the time of the murder. He also explained that Al-Azmi had the right to still appeal this decision by the court of first instance. The Ranara family was informed, and according to De Vega, they were grateful for the assistance the DFA provided the family, but they were not happy about the sentence. In an interview with Radyo 5, Romy Reyes, Jullebee's father, said the following about Al-Azmi's sentence and the possibility of a different sentence later after Al-Azmi's potential appeal. Note that the translation is from a Rappler article from the 15th of September 2023.
Ako ay nalulungkot sa nangyaring ganyan na ang sentensya napakababa. Alam niyo ho, napakasakit. Di ko na kayang tanggapin. Ang inaano ko lang sana, mabigyan naman ng magandang hustisya yung pagkamatay ng anak namin. Taas-taasan pa sana yung sentensya niya na yan para tumapat naman dun sa pagkagawa niya sa anak namin. I was saddened by what happened. That a sentence was so light, it is so painful. I can't accept it. I just want proper justice for the death of our child. They should met out a heavier sentence so that it would be at par with what he did to our daughter.
When Rappler asked Undersecretary De Vega about the sentence, he said that there could not be any harsher sentence as the maximum penalty for murder if committed by a minor is 15 years. De Vega quickly pivoted and said that his department is looking to have the court in Kuwait also grant some financial award to the family. In any case, all of Jullebee's children have been given scholarships by the Filipino government in order to cover any education costs. Whether the Kuwaiti court will be granting some additional financial award or has already done so remains unclear. Finally, going back to Al-Azmi, I don't think he chose to appeal his case. Remember that Al-Azmi had 30 days to appeal his conviction and sentence, and by the time of recording this episode, that 30-day appeals window had long closed, and there are no new articles out there that would indicate to me that there is an ongoing appeal in Al-Azmi's case. So, where are we with this case? I would say that this case is de facto closed now. Up until a few days ago, the again tense relationship between Kuwait and the Philippines looked like it was bound to stay tense. But then the two countries opened dialogue at the ASEAN GCC summit in Riyadh, and it looks like the relationship will normalize again. After a meeting with Kuwaiti Crown Prince Sheikh Mashal Al Ahmad Al Jaber Al Sabah at the aforementioned summit on the 21st of October 2023, current President Bongbong Marcos Jr. stated that both men were on the same page about how discussions about quote-unquote some obstacles still needed to continue before moving forward. One of these obstacles would, of course, be the partial ban for newly hired OFWs. Marcos Jr. said of the Crown Prince and the aforementioned obstacles, quote, he was very effusive in saying we should remove all of those, and we should continue as we had done before, which is a very important development because for a few months now, we have had to ban the deployment of Filipino workers in Kuwait, end of quote. He then said of the deployment bans, quote, that would end and we will now return to the normal state of affairs with the Kuwaiti government. And in fact, they moved very quickly. They have already started discussions at the ministerial level, at the ambassadorial level as well, end of quote. Now, I know you know how I feel about the current president, but even if I were neutral, I would still say that he said a whole lot of nothing with what he just stated. I could be wrong still, and I may have spoken out too soon, and we may still see some drastic and positive changes in a hopefully renewed bilateral agreement that would grant our OFWs greater protection. Our government should not let Jullebee's death go in vain by not taking bold actions in making sure that no one dies at the hands of their abusive employer ever again, because in the end, such actions do not just affect the dead person. Back at home, an OFW's death causes a horrendous ripple effect on their children, parents, siblings, and other relatives. This is a trauma that will transcend years and generations, an added trauma to the already existing trauma that poverty already causes in most of our kabayans who see going abroad as their only way out of poverty. The topic of abuse and murder of OFWs abroad is a tough one. There are so many aspects to it. In the show notes, I've highlighted 3 articles. One focuses on domestic workers in Kuwait and asks the question whether what is going on there is a form of modern slavery. The second one specifically looks at the intersection of being a woman and a migrant or migrant worker in other countries. This is a broad look into many countries and many women, not just Filipinas in the Gulf region. As the introduction says, quote, migration governance has failed to adequately account for systemic racism, sexism, patriarchy, misogyny, and the legacies of slavery and colonialism that are deeply ingrained in the formulation and implementation of migration laws, policies, and services. End of quote. The last article I want you to read focuses on the kafala system but also goes into how the kafala system will always affect female migrant workers more than others. We see how most of the OFW victims of murders are women because apart from being vulnerable on account of their visa status, their economic status, and their race, there is this added aspect of them being a woman, which in and of itself presents many vulnerabilities. I urge you to read even more material because at some point you will have to demand more of the government so that it does more to protect our kabayans abroad. Because you never know when one of your family members finally decide that things at home are so dire that the only way to make decent money is to fly 1,000 miles away from home to a different land with a different culture and traditions, and the feeling that maybe, just maybe, if something happens to me, no one will know until it is too late. Lagim fam, thanks for listening to today's episode and thanks for the support. You might have noticed that around minute 50 or 47, I'm not sure anymore, the quality of the sound may have changed a little bit. My microphone started malfunctioning, so I'm hoping that my editor is able to do some miracle work and adjust it all. But if it sounds wonky to you, that would be the reason why. As always, Lagim fam, I hope you found this episode valuable and or interesting. If you found it interesting and valuable, make sure to rate and review my podcast on Apple and Spotify because it does help with making my podcast more visible to those who do not know about it yet. Also, make sure to follow me on all my socials. Check the show notes for all the links to my Insta, Twitter, yes, I refuse to call it anything else, TikTok and Facebook accounts. Until next episode, thank you so much Lagim fam, daghang salamat, maraming salamat at mabuhay.